Welcome to INSITECT. Today we are talking about facial recognition, biometric data, and the global challenge of GDPR compliance.
It's a huge topic. And, it's probably one of the most important conversations happening right now at that intersection of technology and, well, civil liberty.
Absolutely.
When we were looking at the core sources for this deep dive, the mission became really clear almost instantly. We're here to define and analyze this monumental, almost invisible shift in surveillance.
Right. It's not just about hitting record anymore.
Exactly. It's about how modern systems, specifically CCTV analytics, are leveraging biometric data to create these instant, trackable, and permanent digital identities. They're actively mapping our public and private spaces.
Turning them into, as the sources put it, identity maps.
That's the term.
Yeah.
And the regulatory friction here is just immense. This technological sophistication, this ability to identify millions of people in real time, it's running headlong into the world's toughest legal framework.
You mean GDPR?
GDPR in particular, yeah. The compliance requirements, the need for robust privacy controls, they just don't fit easily with this kind of ubiquitous identification technology.
I think the fundamental hook for our discussion today is really getting our heads around that shift. The era of passive anonymous recording is, for all intents and purposes, over.
It's gone.
A traditional camera, it just captured light. A modern facial recognition system, though, it actively identifies you, it analyzes you, it catalogs you the moment you cross its field of view.
And that logging of your unique biometric signature creates what we have to start thinking of as a permanent digital identity.
That concept of permanence, I think that's central to every single legal and ethical challenge we're about to discuss.
It has to be, because unlike a photo or an ID card you carry in your wallet, that biometric identity, it just persists. It's fundamentally immutable.
Okay, so let's unpack the mechanics of this shift.
Yeah.
It's the difference between, say, looking at an old archive tape versus being a moving data point inside a live indexed database.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
So what are the core technical processes that make this personalized surveillance even possible?
Well, the process is basically a super fast sequence of data transformation. First, the camera captures an image, and at that point, it's just raw light data, nothing more.
Right.
But then immediately, specialized processors kick in and they perform what's called feature extraction. They don't store the whole image. They map the distinctive geometry of the face, the distance between your eyes, the depth of the eye sockets, the shape of your jawline, the contour of your nose. All of that gets converted into a mathematical representation.
A feature vector.
That's it. That's the biometric signature, the unique pattern. It's done through some really complex mathematical modeling that turns what we see as a face into a numerical string that's unique to that person.
Yeah, and then the algorithms take that string and compare it against, what, a huge database?
Millions of stored vectors within a database. But the revolutionary part is the speed. I mean, the entire process, capture, mapping, comparison, matching, it all happens in milliseconds.
So the system can log an identity before a person has even finished walking.
Exactly. Before they've even finished walking through the frame. That's the reality. This rapid, real-time capability is what makes mass surveillance not just possible, but efficient.
It removes that old bottleneck?
It completely eliminates the operational bottleneck of older systems where someone had to sit and manually review hours of video. Now, the system just gives you an immediate match and an identity log.
And this speed is what solidifies that permanent digital identity.
Yeah.
How does the algorithmic processing make sure that identity is stable, not just temporary?
Well, the stability, it comes from a couple of things. The deep training of the models and the very nature of that feature vector itself.
Okay.
The models are trained on these incredibly diverse data sets with millions of faces. They learn to ignore the temporary things like lighting, your expression, or even if you grew a beard. Instead, they just isolate that stable, unique geometry.
So the signature itself is robust.
It's a robust, persistent identifier. Once that unique vector is derived and logged, it's permanently linked to you. A video file might get deleted, sure, but that mathematical data, that ID marker, it can be stored forever using minimal space. Its persistence is nearly indefinite.
That kind of power required a complete reinvention of the surveillance infrastructure.
Yeah.
It seems like the move to distributed intelligence was the key factor.
Oh, absolutely. Early CCTV needed these massive central servers to just ingest and analyze all that raw video. The bandwidth it consumed, the processing lag. It was a logistical nightmare that limited the scale.
So if you had 1,000 cameras, you needed a server farm just to keep up.
Precisely. The big transformation came with edge-based processing. Modern cameras got a lot smarter. They have significant onboard computing power now, so they've become intelligent sensors.
They analyze the images locally at the edge.
That's it. They do the feature extraction and sometimes even the matching right there on the camera before sending any data back to a central hub. This just massively cuts down on bandwidth needs.
And that distributed intelligence is what allows for this unprecedented scale of monitoring.
It allows a single command center to monitor thousands, maybe tens of thousands of cameras at once. Instead of streaming endless video, the system just sends metadata.
An alert, a timestamp, a confirmed ID.
Right. And all of this is powered by deep learning models. These neural networks that have been trained for months, even years, on just vast data sets.
So what makes these models so good in the real world, where, the lighting is terrible and people might be trying to cover their faces?
It's their ability to generalize. They learn the essential geometry, not just the surface details. Because they've seen millions of faces, they can still pull off a highly accurate ID despite huge environmental variables.
You're talking about low light, weird angles.
Low light, extreme angles, partial obstructions hats, heavy glasses, even significant changes in facial hair. The system can still find that core geometric signature. And that level of robustness is what makes it so viable for widespread, real-world deployment where things are messy.
When the technology becomes that effective, the implications really stop being purely technical. They become profoundly psychological, even societal.
That's the next frontier of this.
The difference between just being recorded and being constantly identified. It fundamentally changes the social contract of being in public.
It's the difference between feeling watched and feeling targeted. That persistent, real-time identification triggers a psychological response. The source is called the loss of anonymity.
Right. In the past, being on camera felt impersonal.
Yeah.
That footage was probably never going to be watched.
Exactly. Now, every time you appear, you get logged and indexed against an identity. The system knows you're there, it tracks your precise movements, and it builds a comprehensive history of your patterns.
It turns public space into that digital fishbowl.
You lose the ability to just blend in, to just pass through a space unnoticed. Your movements become quantifiable data points that are used to build these detailed behavioral profiles. And to circle back to that idea of permanence,
the data lives forever.
While the video footage might eventually get overwritten, that extracted biometric signature, the lifetime identifier, it persists indefinitely. That is the core difference. Every sighting is logged forever.
And this analytical power translates immediately into practical uses that create these identity maps. Let's look at how ordinary places are being transformed. How about a shopping mall?
Shopping mall becomes a sophisticated tracking grid. Every camera is an identification checkpoint. The system logs your appearance, tracks which stores you go into, how long you stay, maybe which departments you visited.
And that can be tied to purchase data, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's correlated with purchase data, loyalty card use. These really granular movement traces give retailers an incredibly intimate picture of consumer behavior, letting them segment and target people based on their physical presence.
And in the corporate world, in office buildings, the surveillance isn't always about security. Sometimes it's framed as productivity optimization.
That's where you see the surgical precision tracking. Entry and exit logs are standard, but these systems go way deeper. They analyze brake patterns, identify common routes. They can even derive productivity metrics from co-location data.
Tracking who talks to whom and for how long.
Yes. And the big concern is that performance evaluations or even disciplinary actions could be derived directly from that movement data. And often employees have no transparent understanding of the full extent of the monitoring.
The final layer then is the citywide scale. Public spaces.
When you connect streets, parks, transit hubs through a centralized surveillance network, it shifts control entirely. Law enforcement uses it, of course, but the commodification aspect is enormous. Private companies are increasingly accessing or pooling this data.
So your daily commute, your visit to a protest.
Their daily lunch break. These stop being private activities and they become highly valuable, queryable information assets. The system moves from being a security tool to being a massive, centralized identity database.
The moment that database, that permanent identity is created, it falls squarely under serious regulation. This makes the legal landscape absolutely critical. European law has a very precise definition of biometric data. What does it actually cover?
Well, under Article 4 of GDPR, biometric data is any personal data from specific technical processing related to, well, physical, physiological, or behavioral characteristics of a person, which allows or confirms their unique identification.
So it's broad.
It's very broad. It includes facial geometry, iris patterns, fingerprints, voice prints. The scope is wide because the law recognizes that any unique biological or physical trait used for identification needs special protection.
And if we compare faces to other biometrics, say a fingerprint, why does facial data pose such a unique legal challenge?
The challenge really boils down to collection and control. Faces are subject to involuntary collection. You can't just, opt out of having a face. And trying to cover it in public can raise suspicion in itself.
Whereas a fingerprint usually requires you to actively do something.
Right. You have to touch a sensor. There's a moment of interaction that implies an opportunity for consent or refusal. Facial recognition completely bypasses that decision point.
And the remote capture capability just destroys any traditional idea of consent.
Absolutely. The sources show modern systems can identify a person from dozens of meters away. You don't have to walk up to a gate or touch a screen. Simply existing in the camera's line of sight is enough for identification.
So this remote passive capture makes traditional consent models meaningless.
Practically meaningless, yeah. And it's why the processing requirements have to be so incredibly strict. Then you have the simple fact of unavoidable exposure.
Your face is always out there.
It's the most exposed identifier we have. You can hide a fingerprint, you can modulate your voice, but avoiding facial identification while just going about your day is nearly impossible. This constant exposure just exponentially increases the risk of continuous tracking.
Let's talk about covert collection, because the tech is already moving beyond just the face.
Yeah.
You mentioned gait analysis. What is that, and how does GDPR handle it?
Gait analysis is a non-facial ID method that's getting surprisingly robust. It extracts your identity from your distinctive walking patterns, the specific rhythm, your stride length, your posture, how you swing your arms.
So even if your face is completely covered?
Even with a mask, even if you're trying your best to be anonymous, the system can still potentially tag you based on these behavioral traits.
And GDPR covers this.
It does. Behavioral biometrics like gait analysis operate as a supplementary trackage method. The key legal point is that GDPR protection applies equally to these identifiers. An organization can't just start collecting your unique walking pattern without the same rigorous legal justification that applies to your face.
This all leads to the core legal hurdle: classifying facial data as special category data under GDPR. This is what triggers the highest level of protection. Why is facial data so much more sensitive?
The classification is rooted in two things: inherent sensitivity and inherent risk. First, sensitivity. Facial data automatically reveals characteristics that are protected under GDPR, specifically ethnic or racial origin. You can't separate the biometric process from revealing that sensitive information.
Okay, that makes sense. And the second reason is the high potential for abuse.
Precisely. The power of comprehensive, continuous biometric surveillance poses a profound risk to personal freedom. The sources remind us of historical examples of how this kind of tracking can be used for totalitarian purposes. By classifying it as special category, the law mandates enhanced protections, higher security standards, stricter retention rules to guard against that systemic abuse.
And tying back to what we said at the start, the permanence of the data is the ultimate justification for all this, isn't it?
It's the ethical and legal tipping point. Biometric data is an immutable lifetime identifier. Once it's compromised or published, you are vulnerable forever. You can replace a credit card, you can change a password, but you can't change your face. This irreversible exposure justifies the mandatory enhanced protection that GDPR demands.
So I'm an organization, a company, a city, and I'm looking to deploy this tech. What are the strict requirements I have to meet to be GDPR compliant?
First, and this is the toughest one, you have to find a narrow legal basis for processing. Simple consent is rarely enough, especially when there's a power imbalance, like in a workplace.
Because it's not really freely given consent.
Exactly. Employees or citizens often don't feel they have a genuine choice to opt out. Public interest arguments face intense scrutiny. The bar for justifying biometric processing is set exceptionally high.
This forces organizations to use the mandated mechanism for this, which is the DPIA, the Data Protection Impact Assessment.
The DPIA is mandatory for any high-risk deployment, which by definition includes any systematic processing of special category biometric data with CCTV. This forces a systematic, detailed risk analysis before the system is deployed. It's preventative.
And what does that analysis have to cover? It's not just about technical vulnerabilities, is it?
Not at all. It has to cover the full spectrum. First, yes, technical vulnerabilities, how data is secured, how encryption keys are managed. But second, and just as important, are the social implications. How might this system reinforce existing biases? What's the impact on freedom of assembly? The DPIA compels an organization to prove they've done their due diligence.
This is where accountability really begins. It's about proving you designed the system with privacy at its core, not trying to add it on later.
That's it, exactly. And the DPIA has to be a living document. If the tech vendor changes, if you upgrade the model, if you expand the use case, that assessment has to be updated immediately. Failure to keep it current is often Exhibit A for regulators showing reckless noncompliance after a breach.
Given the power of this technology, when it fails, the consequences can be disastrous. Let's move to the dark side of this. The real-world, human consequences of algorithmic errors, especially false positives.
Algorithmic errors are not just technical glitches, they are life-altering events. A false positive, where the system incorrectly matches an innocent person to a watch list, can disrupt a life profoundly.
We've seen reports of this.
Yeah, we've seen scenarios where people face immediate detention or, in the worst cases, wrongful arrests and lengthy interrogations based purely on an algorithmic mistake.
And the harm goes way beyond the legal system. It can hit you financially, socially.
Indeed, a bank might deny you a loan based on an automated flag linking you to some risk profile, even if it's a total mistake. And the social harm is persistent because, as we've said, the data is permanent. A false accusation can follow you around long after the error is supposedly corrected.
And these error rates, they aren't static, are they? The accuracy of the system can be really unpredictable.
That's a critical point. The data shows that accuracy varies dramatically. Poor lighting, extreme camera angles, compression artifacts from the network, they all compromise reliability. Organizations are deploying these systems knowing full well that error rates can fluctuate, essentially accepting a high degree of collateral damage.
Beyond random errors, there's the systemic problem of algorithmic bias. The critique is that these systems can reinforce and even scale existing societal prejudices. How does that cycle work?
Well, the cycle begins with the training data. A machine learning model is only as unbiased as the data it's trained on. So if the data sets, those millions of faces, underrepresent specific demographic groups, the model will inherently perform worse on those groups.
Right. Studies have shown this. Lower accuracy for people with darker skin tones, for example.
Consistently. And that systematic disadvantage then gets magnified by how the systems are deployed.
You mean the deployment patterns themselves can be biased?
Exactly. Surveillance is often concentrated geographically. If systems are deployed disproportionately in specific neighborhoods, maybe areas with higher minority populations, those residents just experience constant heightened scrutiny. It becomes technologically enforced discrimination.
Which then creates a devastating feedback loop for the human operators watching the screens.
When the system flags certain demographics more often because of its built-in bias, it just reinforces the confirmation bias of the human security operators. The technology ends up automating and scaling existing human prejudice.
Let's talk about ethical overreach and mission creep. Where do we see deployments crossing clear ethical lines, going way beyond their original purpose?
We see it across a few domains. In the workplace, mission creep looks like pervasive monitoring, extending into places that should be private break rooms, tracking who you talk to, even trying to analyze your emotional state through so-called affective computing.
And using that for performance reviews.
Which is a massive violation of reasonable privacy expectations. In retail, it moves beyond just security into outright discrimination.
How so?
When you marry biometric ID with purchase history, you can build these comprehensive profiles. Companies can then use appearance analysis based on clothing or movement to engage in dynamic pricing.
So the price you see is different from the price someone else sees.
And it's totally invisible, technologically enabled discrimination. Then you have the chilling political implications.
Targeting activists.
Automatically. If a system can instantly identify every single person at a protest rally, it creates a chilling effect on democratic participation. People will self-censor because they know their presence is being logged permanently.
And what about the jump from just observing behavior to trying to predict it? That seems like the most dangerous frontier.
It is the most fraught area because it often relies on unproven, sometimes pseudoscientific foundations. You have systems claiming they can predict shoplifting or hostile intent by flagging suspicious movements.
So security intervenes before anything's even happened.
Right. They treat individuals as criminals based on statistical patterns, not actions. This completely undermines the legal principle of innocence until proven guilty.
And the really insidious part of this is how mission creep happens. How does a narrow pilot program gradually expand into this massive surveillance infrastructure without anyone really noticing?
It's an incremental erosion. A pilot program starts with a very defined, narrow scope, say, securing one data center. It's successful, so it expands to other departments. Then new applications are added. It goes from entry tracking to monitoring break times. Oversight just fails to keep up.
And access expands.
More departments, more external agencies get query capability, often without ever updating that initial DPIA. And the retention periods, they get extended indefinitely. What was sold as 30-day storage suddenly becomes a permanent archive. The infrastructure starts being used for things that were never even contemplated when it was first deployed.
Given all these systemic risks, organizations have to implement robust technical safeguards. Let's start with architecture. The choice between edge and cloud processing seems to fundamentally determine the risk.
It's a trade-off between control and capability. The cloud model, sending all data off-site for processing, creates immediate GDPR challenges. The data transmission itself, even if it's encrypted, creates interception windows as it crosses networks.
And you're handing over control to a third-party cloud provider. That's a huge risk multiplier.
It absolutely is. The customer is delegating security for special category data to a vendor. If that vendor gets breached, which happens all the time, the organization that deployed the cameras is still liable under GDPR, and then you have complex jurisdictional issues if the servers are in another country.
So what about the edge approach? Processing the data locally on the camera.
Edge processing dramatically reduces that transmission exposure. The feature extraction happens on device, but it shifts the risk to physical security. If someone steals an edge device, they could have the entire local biometric database.
And it's more expensive.
It requires powerful hardware, so higher costs, more maintenance, and the accuracy can sometimes suffer compared to what you can do with massive centralized cloud systems.
So the hybrid systems that try to blend the two, they just seem to multiply the complexity, right?
They do. Hybrid systems try to get the best of both worlds, but they create this distributed architecture that multiplies the points of failure. Just tracking where the biometric data resides at any given moment becomes incredibly difficult, which makes privacy assessment a nightmare.
So no matter the architecture, there are mandated technical protections you have to have for GDPR-safe analytics. Where do you start?
You start with the philosophy of privacy by design. This isn't optional, it's a legal requirement. You have to build privacy into the core architecture from day one. You can't just bolt it on later after you've designed a system for maximum data collection.
Let's get specific on the tech. Encryption is basic, but with biometric data, it gets complicated fast. What's required?
The data must be encrypted at rest and in transit. That means strong end-to-end encryption for transmission and full disk encryption for storage. But the real complexity is in key management. You have to protect the cryptographic keys as rigorously as the data itself.
And the classic problem, how do you analyze data if it's encrypted?
Real-time analysis, like matching a live stream to a database, often requires temporary decryption. This creates these transient moments of plaintext access. Organizations have to account for these vulnerabilities in their DPIA, proving they have controls in place even for those brief moments.
Moving on to governance. Access controls and logging are vital for these high-risk systems. What does a robust framework look like?
It's all about minimizing internal exposure and maximizing accountability. So strict role-based permissions are a must, ensuring only authorized personnel can even view the data. And multi-factor verification should be mandatory for any sensitive operation.
And the audit trails have to be tamper-resistant.
Absolutely essential. Tamper-resistant logging has to record every single event: who accessed the system, what query they ran, when, and the justification. This comprehensive trail is the forensic backbone you need to investigate any potential misuse.
One of the most effective ways to do privacy by design is automated redaction and masking. How does that work?
This is about implementing data minimization by default. Privacy filters, usually algorithmic overlays, have to automatically obscure identifiable features, like blurring faces in real time. The system processes the image to get the feature vector, but it only retains anonymized data unless an event triggers a specific alert.
So selective revelation is the exception, not the rule.
Correct. Unredacted footage should only be accessed for a flagged event under specific documented justification, and that de-anonymization event has to be meticulously logged.
Finally, let's look at the organizational structure. The duties of the controller versus the processor. Where does the buck stop?
The buck stops with the controller, the entity that determines the why and how of the processing. They bear the primary responsibility and ultimate liability under GDPR. You can't delegate that accountability just by outsourcing the tech.
And the processor, the vendor, has their own duties.
They do. They have independent security obligations, and they have to notify the controller of any breach. The contracts between them, the data processing agreements, have to clearly spell out liability.
What about the risks from the vendor themselves? We've all heard horror stories about technology lock-in.
Vendor risk is so often underestimated. A failure by your third-party vendor exposes you, the customer, to liability. Due diligence has to be intense, and you need to plan for vendor failure. You have to define an exit strategy and ensure data portability before you deploy, so you're not trapped with a non-compliant vendor.
And for any public-facing system, transparency is key. Conspicuous signage is a requirement, and transparency means actual understanding, not just legal jargon.
Right. A generic CCTV and operations sign is not enough. The sign has to unambiguously state that facial recognition is happening, identify the controller, provide contact details, and state the legal basis in clear, plain language.
The last technical control is the data lifecycle, retention rules.
Indefinite storage is a direct violation of GDPR. Organizations have to define clear, justifiable maximum retention periods, and they need automated dilution mechanisms to purge the data when it's no longer needed. Crucially, the system needs to be able to prove that the data has been securely and completely removed.
We've laid out the power, the legal frameworks, and the technical vulnerabilities. The final question is forward-looking. How do we define an ethical path forward and start to rebuild public trust?
It has to start with the core principles of necessity and proportionality. You can't deploy these systems just because they're convenient. You have to pass rigorous necessity tests, prove that alternatives have been exhausted, and stick only to the least invasive approach needed to achieve a legitimate objective.
What about consent? We established it's incredibly difficult to get meaningful consent in practice. How should organizations approach it ethically?
Where consent is sought, it has to be freely given and specific. Identification should never be a prerequisite for essential services. Ethical deployment requires practical, accessible, opt-out options without any penalty.
Beyond policy, the guardrails have to touch the AI itself. Let's talk about fairness and human oversight.
Human oversight is non-negotiable, especially for high-stakes decisions. Automated decisions from biometric data must be subject to human review, and there have to be robust appeal mechanisms. For fairness, you need continuous, mandatory bias testing.
So you actively monitor performance across different demographics.
You have to. And if you find differential error rates, you have to implement corrective actions immediately. The idea that technology is somehow neutral has to be rejected. Fairness requires active enforcement.
And then there's the challenge of the algorithmic black box, the need for transparency and explainability.
Opacity is legally and ethically untenable under GDPR. The logic the algorithm uses has to be explainable. If you can't explain why the system flagged a person, you can't trust the decision and you can't audit it.
These ethical ideas are already being hardwired into new regulations, like the EU AI Act. What's the impact of that going to be?
The EU AI Act is setting the global standard. It specifically classifies facial recognition as a high-risk AI application, which will mandate rigorous conformity assessments before deployment. This is the Brussels effect. Organizations all over the world who serve the EU market will have to adopt these high standards.
So proactive compliance today is really an economic necessity.
It's not just a legal one, no. And that includes anticipating outright bans in some contexts. Public space deployment by governments is facing intense scrutiny globally. Some places are moving toward total bans.
So we circle back to the conclusion. Technology has fundamentally outpaced our democratic and regulatory deliberation. What is the critical choice we face right now?
The choice is between two futures. One where we deploy facial recognition that respects biometric data through robust compliance and privacy by design, or one where we surrender personal autonomy to unchecked technological expansion. It has to be clear that security and privacy are not opposites.
And the evidence suggests that effective security doesn't actually require ubiquitous identification.
Not at all. Proportional, targeted security responses focused on genuine threats, coupled with robust audit trails and human accountability, always provide better safety outcomes than indiscriminate mass surveillance. The future of a free society depends on choosing intelligent, proportional security.
That brings us to the key takeaway for you, the listener. If you're involved in this ecosystem in any way, what is the single most critical lesson about biometric data?
The most critical lesson is that given the special category status and the permanence of this data, organizations have an absolute, non-delegable duty to implement strict privacy by design and a mandatory comprehensive DPIA process before any system goes live. Treating this data lightly is not just poor management, it's a fundamental threat to individual liberty and an enormous liability risk.
And since this technology operates invisibly to the average citizen, and most people don't grasp the analytical infrastructure behind the cameras they see every day, that profound knowledge deficit, what responsibility do we, as informed technology professionals, have in bridging that gap and driving transparent democratic oversight? That is the question that must guide the conversation for the next decade.
It is the defining responsibility of our era.
Thanks for listening. We will continue to talk about security and technology. See you in the next episode.